mitzvah of tzitzis, and in particularly get to the inyan of the Techeles in the mitzvah of tzitzis. But before we begin, I'd like to be magdim a little bit about the mitzvah of tzitzis. The Gemara in the Menachos says, from Daf Mem Gimel Amud Beis, Shkula mitzvahs tzitzis keneged kol mitzvahs. There are very few mitzvahs in the Torah, maybe 4 or 5, where the Chazal say that the shkula certain mitzvah keneged kol mitzvahs. Talmud Torah lemashals keneged kulam. That we understand. But what's this grace inyan in the mitzvah of tzitzis that makes mitzvah of tzitzis shakol keneged kol mitzvahs? And the Sifri even says more. It's not only shakol keneged kol mitzvahs, but it's ki'ilu kiyam kol mitzvahs. When a person is mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzis, it's as if he was mekayim all taryag mitzvahs. What's the big inyan in the mitzvah of tzitzis? How are we to understand why is the mitzvah of tzitzis shkula keneged kol Torah? The Gemara continues and says, Tani yidach uriisem oisai uschartem es kol mitzvahs Hashem v'asisem oisam. The Gemara says, Re'iyah meviyah lidei zchira. When we see the tzitzis, we remember Zechira meviyah lidei asiyah, and the zechira is maybe lidei asiyah. Rashi brings down that the inyan in the mitzvah of tzitzis is because the tzitzis is begematria tof reish, that's 600. V'hei ksharim, if you include the 5 knots, v'ches chutin harei taryag. So together you basically have the taryag mitzvahs in the gematria of tzitzis, and that's the big inyan. That's shakol keneged kol mitzvahs. And again, you have to understand, what is that? Just the gematria, the fact that we remember it, when we look at it, and we remember of all the mitzvahs, is that in itself considered like it's shakol keneged kol mitzvahs? What's Pshat and Rashi? The Gemara later on says, Tanya, Hoy Rab Meir Omer, Man ishtane Techeles mikol tzivoinim. Why did the Torah choose that the tzitzis strings should be dyed with the tzeva of Techeles more than any other color? Mipnei she'Techeles doime liyam, v'yam doime lerekia, rekia doime lekisei hakoved. And Rashi says that when we look at the Techeles, it reminds us eventually of the kisei hakoved. And when we remember the kisei hakoved, remember the Rebbeinu Shloim who's yoshev al kisei hakoved. So again, the mitzvah of tzitzis is here to remind us of the mitzvahs, to remind us of the Rebbeinu Shloim who commanded us to do the mitzvahs. And this way, it's a very special mitzvah that you don't have by other mitzvahs, that this is kol all the mitzvahs. But still, it's something you have to still try to understand what's the nekuda of this mitzvah over all other mitzvahs. The Gemara further says, later on the Amid, Tanya Hoy Rab Meir Omer, Godol oinshoi shel lovan me oinshoi shel Techeles. A person who doesn't put on the white strings, the lovan shebetzitzis, his punishment will be more severe than somebody who doesn't put on the strings of Techeles, the tzitzis of Techeles. And that's because the lovan is much more accessible, it's much more readily available than the Techeles. Techeles is not so easy to find. And so therefore somebody who doesn't listen and doesn't put on the mitzvah, the easier mitzvah of Lavan, is going to be more accountable for it. And he's going to be punished more severely than somebody who didn't put on the Techeles, which is more difficult to get a hold of. The Gemara gives a mashal. Mashal l'madav or says Rab Meir, L'melech basar v'dam sha'amar l'shnei avadav. A melech told his 2 avadim, Le'echad amar havali chaysam shal tit, U'le'echad amar lei havali chaysam shal zav. The Melech commanded both of his avadim. One of them, he said, go bring me a chaysam. It's like a signet, something that they put on a beged, like an emblem of tit. And one of them, he said, go bring me an emblem of zav. Upashu shneim v'lo yeviu. And both of them were paishah. They didn't mekayim the mitzvah Melech. Eizem hem onshoy merubah. Which one of them did a worse aveira, and therefore their punishment is more severe? Havoimer zeh sha'amar lei havali chaysam shel tit. It's Savada referring to the one that was supposed to bring tit, which is much more readily available. It's easier to bring tit. And if he didn't listen to the Melech and bring the easier thing, that's a bigger merida than somebody who was told to bring a chaysam shel zav and was paishah, didn't bring it, because that's much harder to bring. Rashi and Taisus over here ask, what's this remez, what's Genoy, this mushal that Chazal give They compare the tzitzis to the chaysam shaltit. The chaysam is a signet, something that they wore on a beged, and Tosfos says, "Mashemedame chaysam shaltit litzitzis." This that Chazal compare the chaysam shaltit to tzitzis, shekein oisim la'avodim, because that was basically what avodim wore on every eved's beged. In order to show that he's an eved to his odin, he would put on a certain signet, a certain emblem that was always on his beged, and that showed that he was an eved to the melech. Vatzitzis, and the same thing with tzitzis, meid al Yisrael sheim avdei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Wearing a beged of tzitzis is wearing a uniform of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Just like a soldier wears a uniform, and that shows that he is in his army and he's defending the country. And not only does he wear it and it shows people what it represents, but he himself feels patriotic with it. He feels good about it. He's representing his country. He's defending his country. The same thing was with the tzitzis that we wear. Kadosh Baruch Hu gave us a mitzvah to wear tzitzis, and that shows it's made on Klal Yisrael that they're Avdei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it brings Kedisa b'Bameh, the Perek B'Meisha, Kavla da'avdotnan. Now, if we look at the Gemara over there in Shabbos, we see a fascinating thing. The Gemara earlier in Menachos says, on Daf Mem Aleph Amud Beis, Amaisa de Malacha Ashkechei Rav Katina. The Malach met up with Rav Katina, the Mechasias Dina. He was covering himself with a linen beged, which Rashi says there was a Gzeir Midrabanan and it was not mechuyev in the mitzvah of tzitzis, and so Rav Katina was not wearing tzitzis on it. Omar Lei, the Malach said to Rav Katina, Katina, Sdina bekaita, you're wearing linen clothing in the summer, which patters you from tzitzis. V'sar b'la b'sav, and you're wearing woolen begodim in the winter with rounded corners, which patters you from tzitzis. Tzitzis shall Techeles ma teheoleh. So that means you're not wearing tzitzis, so what's going to be with the mitzvah of tzitzis? Omar Lei, so Rav Katina said to the Malach, An shisu ha'esei? This is not a chiyuv, this is not a mitzvah chiyuvis. The mitzvah of tzitzis is a mitzvah that if you have a beged of dalit kanfis, you can't wear it without the tzitzis. But if I don't wear a dalit kanfis beged, I wear it with rounded corners, or if I wear a linen beged which Chazal pater from tzitzis, so there's not going to be an oynish. And shisu essay, do you give an oynish for such an essay which I have no chiv to do? Omar Lei, so the Malach said, yeah, bizman di ikar rizche an shinon. Be'idna de rizcha an shinon. At a time when the Rebbeinu Shalom is kaviyachol be'af, be'chema, when he's angry, he's going to punish even for a mitzvah's essay that somebody should have been mekayim, and he wasn't mechuyev to be mekayim, but he wasn't mekayim. What's the pshat nazar gemara? Lamai says a person is not mechuyev to wear tzitzis. If he has a beged dalit kanfis, he's mechuyev to put on tzitzis. But if you don't have a beged dalit kanfis, why do you have to put yourself into a matzav to wear a beged of dalit kanfis, to be mechuyev in tzitzis, to put on the tzitzis? What's the pshat in such a thing in the Gemara? So I once heard a Meirdik pshat from Reb Gershon Ribner. He said the Gemara in Brachas at the beginning of Bamei Isha Yaitza gives a whole list of clothing and ornaments and different things that Noshim wear, jewelry, that they're not allowed. Some of them they're allowed to go out with in Rosh Hashanah, some of them are not allowed to go out with. And the Gemara first lists off a whole list of different begodim that an Isha is not allowed to go out with. It gives a whole list over there. And then the Mishnah says, V'loi b'tabash and v'loi b'machat, Zog the Mishnah, V'loi b'kovel l'Rosh Hashanah. Neither is she allowed to go out with a beged that's referred to as a kovel into Rosh Hashanah. Rashi says, why does the Gemara, the Mishnah, refer to, when it says kovel, it says a kovel you can't go out to Rosh Hashanah. By all the other things listed earlier in the Mishnah, it doesn't say about not going to Rosh Hashanah. It's mashma zok Rashi that until now, everything that was listed in Chazal that they were concerned that an Isha might carry and take off and carry it, they even answered it not only in Rosh Hashanah, but even in a chotzer. Even though technically in a chotzer amurevis you're allowed, but they were geyser in a chotzer or to Rishus Harabim. If they allow an isha to go out with these begadim in a chotzer, she'll continue to carry it out in the Rishus Harabim. So they even asked her to wear it in the chotzer. Masha'en came by a kovel l'Rishus Harabim. That's the only one that's limited only to Rishus Harabim, but she's allowed to wear it in the chotzer. The Gemara later on in Amud Beis and Zayin Amud Beis in Shabbos says, what's this kavla that an isha is not allowed to wear in Rishus Harabim? The Gemara has a machlokes if kavla means a certain turban that an isha goes out with to Rishus Harabim, or it's referring to this kavla da'avda, this signet, this emblem that an eved wears on his begadim, and that you're not allowed to wear out to Rishus Harabim. And Tosfos says, Bishleim, I understand if the kavla that the Mishnah is referring to is the kavla of a type of a turban that an isha wears. So I understand over there why in this case is the exception. And although every other thing listed in this Mishnah, Chazal answered even to a chotzer, but a kavla, they were mater and isha to walk out in a chotzer, and they only answered in Rishus Harabim. Because, Zok Tosfos, the kavla, avol kippah, Kippah shal tzemert nanicha. Shaloit is gana al baila. Chazal didn't want an isha to be nisgana al baila, and since she's with her husband in the chotzer, so they allowed her to go out to the chotzer with this kavla, this kippah. Masha'en kain in Rishus Harabim, they asked her because she might take it off and carry it. Zok Tosfos, but if you hold it, kavla means kavla da'avda. It's just emblem that they stitch onto the beggar to show that he's an eved. Why over there would Chazal make a chilik and say that this is an exception to the rule and you're only not allowed to carry it to Rishus Harabim, but in a chotzer you are allowed, as opposed to all the other begadim and ornaments and jewelry that Chazal asered, they included also the chotzer al tzigzeira that you might continue to carry it in Rishus Harabim. V'yishleimer Zok Tosfos, the kavla da'avda shari k'dei lasois by kairas ruach l'rabai shim haya kol hayoim beloy kavel afilu b'chotzer b'davar mu'et shiyasa eved k'neged rabbi sover rabbi shedaitoi limroid by v'osi lidei ktata. So Tosfos a murdik of art. Tosfos says that Chazal gave a special heter on a kavla da'avda to allow an eved to wear him in a chotzer. Because if an eved would not be allowed to wear this kavla da'avda that shows that he's an eved, this beged, this uniform, if he wouldn't be allowed to wear it in the chotzer, then as soon as the odin tells him to do even the slightest thing, and the eved would disrespect and disregard and not obey even the slightest tzivoy, his odin would let it out on him, and he would be very, very upset at him, and he would hurt him. And the reason is because he looks at him and he says, "You're not wearing the kavla. Not wearing the kavla shows that you don't want to be my eved. And now that you didn't even respect even the slightest disobeyment, the odin will take it as a tremendous merida by the fact that he doesn't see him bechlal even shtelling tzu and wearing this kavla da'avda that shows that he's willing to become my eved. But if he wears a kavla da'avda and he shows b'yisoid that he's willing to be an eved, and he is his eved, he's wearing the big day avdus, then if he doesn't do something, a shvacha thing, a very minor thing, he won't be so upset at him. That's why Chazal were mater eved to wear kavla da'avda in a chotzer, so that the odin won't be so upset at the eved in case he doesn't obey a small command. So said Reb Gershon Ribner Moirdik, that's pshat in the Gemara in Menachos. Ad shisu ha'esei omerle in be'idna derischa and shinon. That means when a person, the way Tosfos and Rashi bring down in Menachos, wearing tzitzis is wearing a uniform and showing that we're being made, that we're avdei the Rebbeinu Shalom, we're avodim of the Rebbeinu Shalom. When we wear tzitzis, avada, we're not mechuyev to wear tzitzis. It's a mitzvah that if you have a beged of dalet kanfus, you can't wear it without tzitzis. But you're not mechuyev to put yourself into a situation and wear a beged of dalet kanfus so that you could put on tzitzis. But zok the Gemara and shisu ha'esem le'in be'idna derischa. When the Rebbeinu Shalom Kaviyachol is upset at a person for doing the slightest merida, The slightest avera, if the person is wearing the tzitzis, he's wearing yena kavla da'avda, that Taisa says. And the Mela, when a person is wearing the kavla da'avda, the Rebbeinu Shalom says he's masking to be my eved. He wasn't oimid in the nisoyin of this tzivui. Is nit as a geferlich kiviyachol. Masha'in came when a person doesn't put on tzitzis, even though he's not mechuyev to, then Kiviyachol, the Rebbeinu Shalom, even by the slightest tzivui that he doesn't obey, the Rebbeinu Shalom looks at it like Tosis brings down and says, it's a merida, he's not doing this, even the slightest thing he's doing. You know why he's not doing it? Because he doesn't want to be my Eved. The Harai is not even wearing the uniform that's supposed to show that he's an Eved. The Rische and Shina, not on the essay of not wearing the tzitzis. The Rische and Shina, on when a person does the slightest Aveira, he'll get a punishment because he shows that he's doing it out of a merida as opposed to wearing the tzitzis and showing that he wants to be an Eved of Rebbeinu Shalom, and his punkt wasn't oimed on the nisayin, which is not so chomer. Mirza Hashem, next time I would like to get more into the inyan of Techeles, and especially the new Techeles, the Murex Trunkless. But before we do that, I think a little bit of a hakdama is necessary. Mirza Hashem will get to it next time. According to this, it's much more moving and much more understandable. The pshat in the Gemara we mentioned earlier, that shokol tzitzis keneged kol ha-mitzvahs. Vart is not only the fact that it's begematria and it reminds us of all the Taryag mitzvahs, and it reminds us of the Kisei HaKavod, and it reminds us of the Rebbeinu Shalom who's Yoshval Kisei HaKavod, but wearing a beged shel tzitzis in itself is showing I'm wearing a uniform, I'm being made that I'm an Eved of the Rebbeinu Shalom, and any one of the Taryag mitzvahs that the Rebbeinu Shalom will ask me to do, Hineni muchanu mezumen, I'm an Eved of the Rebbeinu Shalom. If Chalila, a person is not oimid on the mitzvah, and he doesn't become the mitzvah per se, that's not a stiri, still is an Eved who wants to do the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Sometimes a person is nichshel, but b'yisoida he's an Eved to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Wearing tzitzis is made on that inyan. Shakul keneged kol ha-Torah, mitzvahs kol ha-Torah kula, and like Chazal say, but wearing the mitzvah of tzitzis is gonna, person is zeiche to see the Shechina, zeiche, umekabel pnei Shechina, the Gemara says.